Hello, welcome to this webinar for using Power BI to automate data cleaning and visualization. My name is Fred Barak, the Director of the Office of Assessment.
I'm Chris Urban, the Assistant Director of Data Analytics.
And we're going to be working through a few examples of how you can use Power BI and be able to manipulate and create dashboards for some of your data. In general, what we're going to go over is how to visualize data and to create interactive reports that are not only useful to you, but in particular, where you're able to take the data that you have and you need for your programs or unit, and those stakeholders you have will be able to interact with those data in various ways. We're first going to look at a variety of electronic mechanisms through which we're able to collect data and put that into a report form. And once we get it into the report form, we're going to demonstrate how both you and your stakeholders can view this data in an interactive format to be able to understand aspects of student learning and also the aspects of the other parts of your data so that they can look at it in ways and understand things that aren't necessarily observable just on the face of the data. So what we're going to do is show you how to take data, as you would see on the left side from the Excel formats, and be able to transfer it into a visualization format to view that data in a different way that you don't normally see in the Excel format.
And so what we're going to kind of cover today, and this is how we use Power BI as well, is bringing in data from a bunch of different sources. Power BI is great at bringing data together from if you have data that's maybe in Qualtrics, some that comes from Canvas, which is what we have. We also connect to the Student Data Warehouse, which is a server that has some data in it. So if you have a bunch of Excel files that you work with, or even just one, you can think about how you might use Power BI to bring that data in, visualize it, and then serve it up in an interactive way. It's a lot nicer to work with your constituents, your stakeholders, instead of giving them just one summary table that then they have to ask if they want changes or it's static so they can't see anything differently, to give them something that's interactive so they can explore a little bit and ask questions on their own rather than you deciding what questions they need to answer by giving them that one report. It also can save time, and we'll show you this on how you can update reports much more efficiently year over year or whenever you get new data so that you can bring in new data and just have it automatically populate in your report.
Before we begin with the presentation, I do want to share with you the format of this particular session. We're going to be working in two different parts. The first half will be how to transform your data into a model that's useful. The second part will be taking that data that you've transformed and cleaned and put that into the visualization format. Now, we will have a break between these two sessions, so at the end of part one, that would be the time when we'd ask you to type in any questions and we'll respond to those. And we will also give you a time at the end of part two to ask particular questions. So you might want to take note as we go through of the questions that come up into your mind as we walk through the presentation. If you happen to have Power BI on your computer, you could try to follow along, but it might be just as well just to listen and observe the steps that we go through. This will be placed on the web, so you can come back to this later, and we will have electronic handouts that you can also work through to be able to put this into application at a later date.
So as Fred mentioned in the first part for the first hour, this is going to go 2 hours. In some of the communications I had sent, I said it was only going to be 1 hour, so I apologize for that. We will get through most of it in that first hour and a half, probably hour 45 minutes. So if you can, stay great. If not, we will be recording it and posting it on our website and sending it out when this completes. So this first part will be talking about sort of preparing your data, cleaning it, and automating the transformation of your data so that it's ready to go and ready to be visualized. And then in the second hour, we'll actually show you how to visualize it, how to update your report, and how to publish it and share it. So before we get into actually working in Power BI, I'm going to cover just a couple of concepts that are really, really helpful in understanding how Power BI works and how you might start to think of your data a little bit differently, especially if you're just coming from using just one like Excel spreadsheet. Power BI works a little bit differently than that. If you've ever used Access before, it's very similar to that, or if you're familiar with any sort of database kind of design, Power BI kind of works a little bit more of that. And the concept in Power BI is relational data modeling, or just data modeling. And that's kind of a new thing that if you want to get working in Power BI and working very efficiently and working to where your data really works for you, understanding this is really, really helpful. So data model, as Power BI kind of makes it work, is made up of two different types of tables. And those are fact tables and dimension tables. And fact tables are things you would want to aggregate in some way or analyze in some way. So you might want to sum something if you have, let's say, if you have a count of students and you want to sum those up and get a total, that would come from a fact table. If you want to average scores, let's say average responses to a survey, which is the example we're going to use, you would average those from a fact table. Those would be contained in a fact table, the responses that you want to average. You want to count up the number of students, etc. So fact tables are used to aggregate and analyze. Dimension tables, in contrast, are the tables you'd use to break down or disaggregate the results from a fact table. So in our example, we'll have a bunch of different dimensions, but one we'll use is student dimension, which maybe has the student's gender, their transfer status, their major, their college, etc. And now you might think about, in a fact table, maybe you have the number of scores or the percent of scores or responses students respond in each category to a survey, and maybe you want to see those by major. So the major would come from the dimension, the responses would come from the fact table.
As we're talking about these two different constructs, I'd like you to notice something in the visualization. On the left side in the fact tables, there's a title of that particular table that says fact responses. And the right side, dim, like dim student. That's very important in order to maintain your organization of your Power BI, all the files that you have in there. If it's a fact table, it's a good idea to use the word fact before you put what is in it. So in other words, fact responses, this is a table of responses, and it's a fact table. It has all of your data, which are the responses to a question or a survey, etc. The dimension, of course, as Chris mentioned, was the things that you're going to use to filter your fact table. So you want to begin the title of that table with dim, so you know it's a dimension table, and then the word after the word dim tells what's in that table. So in other words, this is the student information that you're going to use as a filter.
And we'll come back to this over and over throughout the rest of this session. So fact tables and dimension tables have some sort of tendencies. So if you think about a fact table, it tends to be long and narrow and duplicated. In our case, duplicated by student. So you might see same student over and over again to show the student, the question, and their response to that question. And whereas a dimension table would be short and wide and unduplicated. So in this case, you might have one row indicating the student's information. So you might have one row with the student ID and then their major, whether their transfer status, whether they're resident, etc. And then these two types of tables relate to each other, and that's the relational part of this in a data model. And they relate to each other via key fields that allow them to know what students you're talking about in a dimension to then filter the fact table. So in this case, we have a student ID field. And this could be anything as long as it's the same data. It could could be a WID, it could be an EMPL ID, it could be an EID, it could be a variety of things. In this case, we're just using some dummy data. It's just an ID. And then what happens is the student IDs, those columns connect to each other. They relate through a relationship. And that's what allows you to select gender or transfer status in your dimension to then flow over to the fact table and filter or break down your responses by those attributes that come from the dimension. So you break down your fact table by transfer status, let's say, and you'll see them the results broken down.
Just for another visualization to understand what Chris had just mentioned, this student ID, when it's got that field, that means there's a column in the table of facts of student ID, and that very same column is in dimensions. So that's how that connection gets made.
And we'll see this in just a minute when we start working in Power BI. Once you start thinking about facts and dimensions and bringing these into Power BI, and you get a few dimensions, what they do is they generally surround a fact table and form what's called the star schema. And this is what you're kind of shooting for when it comes to your data. So you have maybe your fact table in the middle, and then surrounding that, you would have dimensions, maybe a student dimension. Maybe you want to break things down by what semester the responses came from. So you might have semester dimension, what course it came from, what question the students are responding to in the survey, and the actual responses and response text. So this is what we're going to build over the next 45 minutes or so. And we'll bring in the fact table, and we'll bring in the dimensions and connect them all together to build this star schema. Again, this is what Power BI kind of works really well with. So it's helpful to understand this so that when you start bringing in your own data, you can think about how different files sort of connect to each other. And then if you can get it into this format, your life is a whole lot easier when you're doing the rest of your visualization and dashboard development.
As we're working through this, think of what data that you have and what areas that you might want to sort your data or disaggregate your data with. So it may not be these areas, but think of the different type of filtering that you want to be able to look at your facts, your data fact tables with. So it can be, we're using this as an example, but think of your data so you can transfer the ideas into your own structure.
So what we're going to do is first we're going to get our raw data, and we'll use Power BI to connect to that raw data. We'll use Power BI to clean and prepare that data, and then we'll load that and form our data model. So our data, when it comes out of our system, let's say Qualtrics or whatever spreadsheet we have, it's not going to be in the right format probably. It's going to need some cleaning. It's going to need some additional fields we want to use. It's going to need some restructuring to fit into that star schema as a factor dimension. So we're going to use Power BI to automate all that. And what that allows us to do is next year, just bring in the raw data again. So we don't have to constantly download an Excel file, change it, do a bunch of manipulation to it, and then load it in. That takes a lot of work and that takes a lot of time. If we can get all of these steps automated or built into Power BI, it will do all this stuff for us so that we can next year, and we'll show you this, just bring in our new raw data, load it, and within minutes we can have an updated report rather than hours or days. And one last thing before we go into Power BI is I do want to mention Power BI is kind of a suite of various services and programs and things that all work together. So we're going to be working today in Power BI Desktop. That's free to download. And what that does, that's kind of your creator, that's your editor. And what that lets you do is create queries and do your automated cleaning steps and connect the data, and also create reports that are interactive. Those reports then get published to what's called the Power BI service, and that's where end users would go in and actually on the web and interact with the dashboard. But right now we're going to work in Power BI Desktop to actually create our report. All right, so now we'll actually start our step-by-step demonstration, and to do that, the first thing we're going to do is actually look at what report we're kind of shooting for. This is the finished version, and you'll get an example of this in the resources we send you when this session is complete. So what we want to get to is actually over here in our model view, and we'll just look at this real quick. And you can see, if I zoom in a little bit, we have a fact responses table in the middle, and then surrounding that we have a student dimension, we have a term dimension, our course, our response, and our question dimension. And you can see they are connected to each other by those key fields. So if I mouse over, there's a student ID field and a student ID field, and that's what connects our facts and dimensions. So term is connected by semester, question is connected by question, etc. And this is what we're going to build over the next half hour or so. And then that will allow us to create a report that looks very similar to this. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to open up a new Power BI desktop window with just a blank report in it.
While this is coming up, I do want to remind you that this, of course, is as Chris mentioned, the desktop creator. When there is a online version that Chris had also mentioned that the viewer will go to, you go through the K-State server and you can get to that viewing point, but that is not the creator. This is a separate program on your computer that you would download.
Yep. And so once you download and install that and then open it, it will look like this. You'll get to just a blank screen with a canvas in it that's blank because you don't have any visuals yet. And if we look at our other view, we don't have any data in there, so we don't have anything in our model either. So this is our Power BI desktop, just the screen you get to when you open it up. One of the key things to know about in Power BI desktop is this edit queries button here. And what that does when you click on that is it opens up the query editor. And that is where you automate your data cleaning processes and transformations. And then that's the query editor is what does that for you. And then it loads data into your data model in a more prepared form. So the query editor is the one thing you want to know where you're at, whether you're in the query editor or you're not, so that you know whether you're trying to edit queries or whether you're trying to build visualizations. So I'll go ahead and click on the Edit Queries button here, and that will pop open the query editor. And so here's the query editor, and you can see I don't have any queries. It's just blank. So the first thing we need to do is to connect to some data. And to do that, we'll just click on New Source. And when I click on New Source, it pops open a window that shows all the different kinds of source files you can use. So we have, Excel or a text or a CSV file. Those are pretty basic. You can connect to PDFs. If you have an Access database, it will bring that in for you. And there's a bunch of different types. Most of these are business and marketing related. But there are a lot of different options for bringing in data and what kind of things you can connect to. For our example today, we're just going to do CSV files to make it simple. So I'll click Text CSV and click Connect. So I will find my file, and what I'm going to bring in here is a survey export from a couple years ago, from fall 2016, spring 2017. And then I'll just click Open. And then it will give me a preview of what I'm looking at. Make sure my delimiter is selected correctly as a comma, and it is. And I'll click OK. So what that did is I just connected to that file. I didn't import it really. It's really making a connection. So if that file changes, this data will change as well. But now that is here, and I can then edit how the data is used in Power BI. And what we can see here is what's in the file. So we have a student name, we have that ID, we have a course and semester, and if we scroll to the right, we have some additional things. We have the course ID, and then we have these are the questions with the ratings. So overall effectiveness as a teacher, being well prepared for class, etc. So there's a bunch of different questions here. Keep scrolling to the right, and you can see the responses are in numerical format 1 to 5. So that's what's contained in this file.
I'd like to reinforce the question that you probably will come up as you're watching Chris edit this. The question is, when you edit this, will it actually edit your original file? And the answer is no. The editing is happening inside of BI. You are not changing the original file, but it is being manipulated inside of the program.
Yep. So the first thing we want to do is actually rename this. So this is going to be the basis for our fact table. So over here in the name field under properties on the right side, I will just type in fact responses. So this is a fact table that contains all of our responses to this survey. So if you remember from the PowerPoint, a fact table tends to be long and narrow and duplicated. So in this case right now, our table isn't in that format. It actually has a student, and each student has a row with all their questions in it. So for that student, they answered a 5 for this class, and this question a 5 for that one, etc. So what we need to do is actually convert this into a fact table. And the way we're going to do that is we're actually going to unpivot a bunch of columns. And I'll show you what that does here in a second. The first thing we want to do is actually select all of these question and response columns. And you do that by left-clicking on the header, and you'll see it highlights it just to select it there. And then I'll scroll all the way to the right, and I'll hold my Shift key and click on this last one, and now all the questions are selected. So I'll scroll back to the left, and you can see they're all selected there. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on the question header, and it gives me a bunch of options, a bunch of transformations I can do. And the one I'm going to choose here is unpivot columns. And I'll explain it in a second once this is finished. So I'll click unpivot. And now you can see what happened is all the questions that used to be column headers are now here in rows, and all of the associated responses are in this new value column. And if we scroll over here to the left, now you can see the students are all duplicated. So unpivoting, what that did was take all of the column headers I selected, which were all these questions, and pivoted them down or unpivoted them down to become row values with the associated responses. So unpivoting is a very, very powerful thing that is built in. If you were to try to do this in Excel, it would take a long time. It would be a lot of manual work. So this is a great thing to know about, especially if you're working with survey data or data that's contained in a bunch of different columns, and you want to get it all into one column for use in a fact table. So this is a really nice thing to be able to do. You'll also notice over here in my applied steps list here, unpivoted columns is now a step down below. And so what you're doing here really is you're essentially programming by clicking buttons. So this is kind of the program that's running on this data. So if I click up in a step, it will actually go back, and now all the questions are as columns again. And if I click down, it will show me what it looks like once that step is applied, and now all the questions are in one column. So the next step is to rename these columns, because by default, it shows up as attribute and value. And we actually know that these aren't just general attributes, these are questions. So we'll call this question, and this field will be responses. And I'm renaming those by just double-clicking on the column header and then typing in a new value.
What's important about what you just saw is eventually you're going to have lots of tables with lots of very similar titles on it. And it eventually becomes difficult to remember which column was which until you can name it in a way that is going to make sense to you. So the naming conventions of columns and of your tables are very important.
Yes, and one other thing that's also important is the data type for each of your columns. And you may be used to this in Excel or other kind of tools you might use. So if you look up here in each column, there's a little icon next to each column name that tells you what kind of type, what data type it is. And if you click on that, left click, it will show you what type it is. So this is text, which is right. Questions are all text. And this one, course ID, is a whole number, which is right. But if we look at responses, it actually shows us a 1.2, which is a decimal, which isn't right. These aren't decimals. These are whole numbers. So we'll click on that and then just click whole numbers, and that will change it over to a whole number. And it's important to make sure Power BI knows this. It'll try its best to automatically detect that. But if you can just sort of verify that whenever you bring data in and transform it, it can be really helpful and make your the rest of your process easier.
Another reason this is important is because if you have a responses column in one table that you want to connect to a responses column in another table, and one column happens to be a whole number and the other one happens to be a decimal, it won't be able to make that connection. So being able to revise these and turn them into the actual type is an important aspect.
And you see that the rename columns that I did and this change type by changing this over to a whole number, those are all again listed in my applied steps. And I can click back to preview what it looked like before. I can also click the X to actually, if I didn't like what happened when I ran that or did that process, I can click the X and it will actually get rid of that step. So it's really nice and handy to have this here showing you all the steps that are going on. This is really like if you think about the undo menu in Excel, and you can look back and see, except this is more flexible. It's not, your changes aren't necessarily permanent, and you can go back and preview what your data look like at each step and see what's happening all along the way. You can also go back later on. If you come back to this in 6 months, you can see exactly what's happening to your data and make any changes that are necessary. So now we've made a few changes to this fact table, and it's in a pretty good format. So what we want to do is say, okay, we've made a bunch of changes. Now we want to actually load this table to our data model, and then we can use it for visualization. So to apply all the steps that we did, we just click this close and apply button in the upper left-hand corner. And that will close the query editor, and it will load our data. And ours should just take a second because it's not that big. And now our fact responses table is over here. And if I click over to this model view, you see our fact response table is right here. And you see it has question and responses as those two new or transformed columns that we made through the unpivoting step. So that's the first table. Now we need to do all of our dimensions that surround that fact table. So to do that, we'll actually go back to the query editor because we need to bring in some more data and do some more transformations. So to go back to the query editor, just click on Edit Queries at the top. Now I'll pop open the query editor, just right where we were a second ago, and now we can start getting some more data. So to do that, I'll just click on New Source, and we'll do the exact same thing we did before. We'll bring in a text CSV file, connect to it, and in this case, what I want to bring in is our student demographics table. Click open there, and this all looks good, so I'll click OK. And what's in this table is student ID, has our gender, major, entry college, whether the student's a transfer student or not, what their current major is, as well as some other fields about residency and whether they transferred from an internal major or changed their major. So this could have a bunch of different things depending on what the need is and what questions you're trying to answer. But this is the subset we're using here. So the first thing we want to do, just like we did with the fact table, is just rename this. So we can do that over here in the properties window, and we'll call this dim student.
We're using the word dim in front of it because now we know that this table is going to be used to filter your fact table. So we're going to call it dim and put student after it because this is the student information. It helps you to find which table it actually is later on when you get a whole list of many different tables.
Yeah. And the other thing you can do here, I mean, you can do any sorts of transformations you want to do, but one example we may want to do is just remove some columns because we don't want them in our data model. We don't want them cluttering things, and we're never going to use it. So what you can do is just right-click on, let's say, this internal transfer, and then there's a remove option here, and that'll just remove that column, and it added that step. So again, that didn't affect the source file. It's just removing it here, so when we load it to our data model, that column won't be available because we don't need it.
This is also very useful because some of the tables you're going to bring in have many different columns. And if there's lots of columns that you aren't going to use, by getting rid of them, it's easier to find out what data you actually have that is useful.
And so we made our changes. Otherwise, dim student looks pretty good. So we'll go ahead and click close and apply again to apply all the changes we made. So once that loads, now you'll see in our data model, we have our dim student table. And if we look at the relationship, there's a relationship between student ID and student ID, and that's correct. And you can see also that student ID on the student side has a 1, indicating it's unduplicated. And student ID on the responsive side has an asterisk, which indicates that it's duplicated. So this is what you're going for in terms of relationships, is your dimensions will be unduplicated and your responses or your fact table will be duplicated with whatever key field you're using to connect them.
And the reason it connected automatically is because there were 2 columns with exactly the same title. So making certain if there is a title that needs to have that relationship, making sure the title actually matches what's in the fact table.
All right, so we brought in our student table. Now we need to continue on and bring in some other dimensions. So again, to do that, we'll go back to the query editor by clicking on Edit Queries. And then we'll click on New Source again and bring in another text CSV file. And this one, we'll bring in our list of courses and click OK. And the course file has the course ID, course name, instructor information, the term it was offered, the subject, and the catalog number of the course. So all we'll do on this one is just call it dim course. And that one looks good. So we'll go ahead and bring in another table while we're here, clicking on New Source. And we'll bring in a text CSV. And this one will bring in is the terms, so the list of semesters. And click OK. And you can see this one has semester in a variety of formats. So it has the shortened version, it has the title. You may also have the code, which this one does at the right. Also has the calendar year that's associated, the academic year that's associated. And so all we'll do on this one is just rename it dim term. And now we have our dim term table. And so now that we have both of those, we'll go ahead and click close and apply and have those load. And so you'll see once these come in, I'll drag them over here so you can see them all together. You see the relationships aren't quite right because dim course is connected to term and that doesn't look quite right. So we'll fix those here in a minute once we get the rest of our dimensions built. So to get the rest of our dimensions, go ahead and go back to Edit Queries. And one other way, besides connecting to data in an Excel file or a CSV file or on a server, to use data and get data in Power BI is actually to enter that data manually. So this is very useful if you have just a quick mapping you want to do, or you have data that you just want to type in and it's faster to do that, or you can copy paste from some other system. So to do this, there's an Enter Data button up in the ribbon, and if you click on Enter Data, it will open up just a place where you can type in data into a table. So I'm going to name this table dim response. So this will be our responses to the survey, and it will give us the numerical value along with the text value that's associated with it. So I'm going to take a minute to just start typing these in.
So what Chris is typing in are the possible responses that could be with each question. Each question had a choice of 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5. So that's why there's the numbers there. Each of those responses are associated with a particular descriptor. So 1 is very low, a 2 is low, 5 is very high. So that's the reason we'd want to create that column. Now, within these particular responses, several of them fall, if we want to organize them in categories, 1, 2, and 3 or 1 and 2 we're going to call a negative response. So we're going to create that category. 3 we're going to consider as the middle of the road, and 4 and 5 are our positive responses. So now we have the opportunity to disaggregate these in groups. So this is creating that group.
Yeah, so this really allows you to summarize. So, you know, very low and very low, or very low and low are very small numbers of students responding in those. Putting them together will let you see them more easily. And we'll see it with this when we actually go to create the visualizations. So I'll go ahead and click OK there. And so now we have our dim response table and a response, text, and category. And you can see as well over here in this applied steps, on the source, there's this little gear icon. And this gear icon is important to know about, because what it allows you to do is go back and edit. So if I made a typo in here or something like medium, I forgot the E, I can go back in there and add it and click OK. And then now this will be updated to have that change in it. So the gear icon lets you go back and edit certain steps that have a window usually that pops open. So the last dimension we need to create is our question dimension. And the question dimension, what we want to actually do is derive this from data we already have. So in our fact responses table, I click on that query and scroll to the right, you see we have already a list of all the questions from the survey. So we want to use this data since we already have it, rather than retyping these in or creating a whole nother file. So what we want to do is actually reference this fact responses table to get these questions while taking advantage of all these steps we've already done in fact responses. So I'll do that, and then Fred will explain what's actually happening here. So I'll right-click on fact responses and then click reference. And you'll see what that does is creates a new fact responses, looks exactly the same as what fact responses looks like with all the steps applied that we already did.
If you notice, it looked like we simply duplicated and created a second fact response, but in essence, we did not duplicate it. The word reference means that we're pulling the data from fact responses. The reason that it is important is if a change is made in fact response, let's say next year we add a new question in there, we want that to be reflected in the dim question dimension table. So since we're pulling from fact responses, if something is added or changed in the original fact response, it'll automatically change in the question. If you had selected duplicate, then it would have copied it without that connection. So if there was a change in fact response, it would not be referenced in the questions.
Yeah, so just to show you how this works is right now in this, I renamed this dim question. We have A1 in here, overall effectiveness as a teacher. But if I go to fact responses and I scroll over to the question column and click the little filter and filter out, unselect A1, overall effectiveness as a teacher. Now if I go to dim question and I scroll over there, A1 will be gone in here as well. And that's because when you reference, there's still a connection between those two tables. So any change you make in fact responses will be reflected in dim question. So I'm actually going to go back to fact responses and click X on that filter rows to get rid of that step because I want to keep all those questions. So now it's back to where we were. So in dim question, we want to do a few other things to get this into more of a dimension format. And the first thing we want to do is just extract just the list of questions. So I click on the question column to select it, then right-click. There's an option here to remove all the other columns. So I'll click that, and you'll see that will remove everything else and just leave our question list. And now we want to unduplicate these because they were in a fact table, so they were duplicated. So I want to unduplicate them by right-clicking again and then clicking Remove Duplicates. And now we have our unduplicated list of questions, and that's what we want in this dimension. So the next thing we want to do is start adding a few other categories here, because maybe we want to see individual question, yes, but we might also want to see by question all the B questions that go into a certain category, or all the C questions that go into a certain category, etc. So to do that, we can do some manipulation on this column to extract the category information. So I'll click on the column, the question column, then up in the ribbon, I'll go to Add Column, and then there's an option here to extract. And we can extract the first characters. So this will say how many characters do we want to extract. So I want to extract the first 3 characters. So you get the letter, the period, and the number associated with it for each question. So I'll click on that, click 3, or type in 3, and then click OK. And now you'll see that extracted the first 3 characters from the question field into a new column. So go ahead and rename this as code. And then now we want to use this again to add some additional columns and create those categories. So this is the whole code, but now we want to just extract the letter that's associated with each column, each question. So click on code to select it, and then we'll extract again. And this time we'll do text before delimiter. And that will say, okay, before this symbol or after this symbol, what do you want to get? So there are a lot of different options here for manipulating text and using this to sort of build in your transformations and sort of categorize your data. So that's really what we're going for here, is to show you a few examples, but there are a lot of different ones you can use. So text before delimiter, we'll just do a period to say get the text before the period, and click OK. And now you see it extracted the letter that's associated with the code for that question. So I'll rename this to category, and there's that new column. So the next thing we want to do is create the text that goes along with this category. And that way, when we go to visualize and display our data, we can display, instead of A, B, C, D, E, we're going to display the text that's associated with that category. So to do that, what we're going to add is a conditional column. And that's up here in the Add Column tab of the ribbon. There's a conditional column button. And if you click on that, it'll pop up in an editor. And basically what you're doing is a bunch of different if statements. Say, if this column equals this, then this. If this column equals this, then that. So we're going to call this our category text column. And we'll say if the category column, which again has our letters that we extracted. So if category equals A, then overall score. So that is that overall effectiveness, and so that's in the overall score category. And then we'll add another rule to say if category equals B, then this is the engagement question, or the engagement list of questions. So you can see explaining subject matter, that might be an engagement question, communicating interest in helping students learn, etc. So that's engagement. So I'll go ahead and add the other categories here.
This is a nice place where you can think about what type of organization or filtering or disaggregation you want to use later on. It's an opportunity then when you do get the data in a visualized format that instead of looking at the responses to each individual question, you can look at responses of groups of questions and be able to visualize these responses in a way that someone who doesn't know your data will actually be able to understand the meaning of the data.
Yeah. And I also added this otherwise. So if it doesn't equal any of these, if we have a question we've never seen before or a question category we've never seen before, let's say F gets added in the future, it will show up as unknown. And that gives us a hint once we update the report to go back and change that and add the F so that it won't show up as unknown anymore. So it's nice to put something here that will tell you, hey, go fix something back in your query. So click OK there. And now you can see the associated category text has come in with the question and the code and the category. So now we have our dim question, our question dimension created. So we'll go ahead and go home and click close and apply. And that will load. And I'll go ahead and move these over here. Our question and response dimension into our data model. I'm just going to move these around here.
So it seems like Sarah doesn't really have a.
So get our fact table in the middle.
Whatever we say would be fine.
And so you see that there's some relationships that aren't made and there's some relationships that are wrong. So we'll fix these really quick and then we'll answer your questions for a couple minutes. Looks like dim question has a good connection, so that's good. Student we already saw is good. Term is good. Response wasn't connected. And you'll see this has responses and this has response. Now that's okay. It's just that it didn't automatically detect a relationship between the two. But what we can do to make a connection and make a relationship is click on response, the column here, name, and drag it over to responses and let it go. And now you see it made a connection between those two fields. So the other thing you can do is you can delete relationships. So we don't want term to connect to course. We want course to connect to our fact table. So we'll just click on this relationship. We'll right click on it and then click delete and confirm that. And then that relationship went away. So now the last thing we want to do is try to connect dim course to fact responses. So we'll drag our course ID up. And you'll see it gives us this error down here. And the reason it did that is because course ID here isn't actually unduplicated because course ID is reused for every semester. So what we need to do is create a key field that's both the course ID and semester combined, and that will give us our unique value on the dimension side that can connect to the duplicated value on the fact responses side. So to do that, we'll go back into our query editor, clicking on Edit Queries, and we'll start in dim course. And what we'll do is we'll click on the course ID, then the semester, and hold Control to select them both. And then we'll go up to the Add Column tab and click Merge Columns. And this will add a new column that merges these two pieces of information together.
Now, if you noticed, Chris chose one and then the other. If he had changed it and shows it in the different order, it's actually going to merge them together in whichever order he clicked.
Yep. And so when I name it too, I'm going to name it as the course ID, then the semester, indicate which order it's in. And this is just going to be a key field. It's not going to mean anything otherwise, because if we scroll and look at it, once we merge it, it shows just that number along with the semester, but it gives us our unique field that we can use to make a connection. So I've done that here. I also need to do that in fact responses so that there's a key field to link it up to with a relationship. So I'll click on fact responses and I'll scroll over. And again, I'll click course ID first, then hold Control and click semester. And then again, merge columns. And I'll call it again, course ID semester key. And click OK. And scroll to the right. You can see the new column here again with our course ID semester key. And so now I'll just, because we made those changes, I'll click close and apply. It'll reload those two tables. And now we have a relationship between course ID and dim course and fact responses. So now we have our data model with all of our dimensions and our fact table in this nice star schema. And in the second half, we will start using this to actually create our visualizations.
I do want to reinforce that that key field that Chris just created was created simply so that those two tables would talk to each other.
Speak that way. So if you have any questions about this first half, about the data modeling part of it, we'll be happy to take those now.
Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, you can either talk into your mic and ask a question if you will unmute your mic, or you can type it in either way. Well, maybe there doesn't happen to be any questions. Oh, here's one, I think.
Yeah, so we'll talk about this at the very end, but the software, the editing software, is free to download and use. So you can download and try it out, and it's the full capability of the software to create is free. When you're sharing with other people, that's where the cost comes in. And that's what we'll talk about in detail at the end of the second half.
So are there any other questions?
So for that course ID semester key, what we use is the merge. Yeah, we use under the add column tab, we use merge. So I can show you that real quick. I go into the query editor and I'll go to add column, and there's a merge columns. But to get that enabled, what you have to do is select multiple columns by holding Control, and then it will give you the merge columns option. So that's what we use to create that new key field.
Just to let you know, if you hadn't noticed, you could also right-click and there'd be a merge, but if something different would happen if you used the other merge. Want to talk about that, Chris?
Well, there is another merge that is, if I select two columns and I right-click and choose merge, that will just merge them. It won't create a new one, so it won't keep our originals there. You want to, whenever you merge, probably merge those into a new column, which is under that add column step.
Yeah, that's an important thing, because some people have done that in the past, and then that messed up some of the data that they wanted to be able to use later.
There was another question about having everything in one Excel file. You don't have to pull everything out to create dimensions. And it's not necessary if your file is in is pretty small and in a relatively simple format, and you don't want to add anything else to it, or you're not planning to add anything else to it in the future. So when I started this, I worked with just like one file from a senior survey that we did, and I didn't pull anything out into dimensions. I just did the unpivoting and then just visualized it from that one fact table, essentially. It is helpful if you are planning to build this with other files into the future or connect it to other things, to start to think about how you might pull things out in dimensions, or what other data you might bring in to connect to the data you do already have, and think about how you might structure it that way. Because again, Power BI, especially as you get more complicated, works much better when you have those facts and dimensions built separately and put into that nice star schema format.
I want to mention something that people didn't ask, and it was mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth mentioning again. Quite often people will ask, well, isn't it better to clean the data before you even bring it in so it's cleaned up? And the answer is no. You should not clean your data in your Excel file before you bring it in. And the reason is this, and you'll see this in the second half. Each year, or each time you bring in data in the past, if you do all the cleaning inside of Power BI, you never have to clean it again, because the Power BI does the cleaning for you. It saves you tremendous time in the future. It also will be able to help you if you bring in data from maybe in a future year, and then something's changed in that data that you bring in. Then you're able to simply make those small adjustments inside of Power BI to be able to adapt to the new data. So that's the reason it would be better to keep your original data in its original form.
Okay. So
I had a question.
go ahead. Yes.
Do you, what's the best way to add in any sort of custom data? I guess I use a lot of Excel spreadsheets to pull up, to pull together the data. And let's say you need to correct it or something. You don't want to destroy the raw data, but you want to make it a note so you can report on it. Can you add any column in your table here and then in that necessary data by row?
So this will not let you really do the row level entry. So if you see, I can't like double click on any of these fields or add a new column, and that's the one thing that I had to get over in working here instead of in Excel. So if you have another type of column, there are a couple ways to get that sort of more, I don't know about manual categorization in. So you can create that mapping file in Excel and then bring it in and merge it with one of these other queries you already have. So you can, there is a, if I go to Home tab, there is a merge queries, and that will take, basically does a VLOOKUP. And so it maps and merges two queries together. You can also do an add column. There's an add column from examples. And what that does is it kind of, it kind of takes in the, it takes in some inputs, and it sort of suggests some things here. So if I try to type in lab and then lab, it might take, it might automatically categorize some things for me based on what is in the other column. So there are some options for that, but if you want to do any sort of manual thing where you're actually making a decision row by row, that still has to be done in Excel. There's no real way to do any manual row by row entry in Power BI.
Thank you very much.
Sure. So we're going to go ahead and move on so we don't run out of time for the second half. Again, keep your questions ready. We'll have some time at the end, hopefully, for that.